One of the most successful and violent trafficking organizations to ever come out of Sinaloa was led by a group of brothers that began life in poverty in the mountains of the Golden Triangle. The cartel they created would grow into an international empire worth billions. Led by the oldest brother, the Beltran Leyva cartel would go on to cement its name within the drug world for being some of the best to ever do it. But before all the wars, all the plazas, power, and money, it all started with one man, Arturo Beltran Leyva. He created the organization that bears his last name. Known throughout the trafficking world as a ruthless and astute trafficker, his decades-long climb to power would bring him to the top of the narco industry. His downfall would arrive faster than expected and leave a legacy of infamy. Marcos Arturo Beltran Leyva was born on February 5, 1958 to Carlos and Ramona Beltran Leyva. He was the firstborn for the couple. Even though his first name was Marcos, most people called him Arturo. He grew up in La Palma, a small town in the highlands of Sinaloa. Back then, La Palma had less than 160 residents, one of countless places deep in the Golden Triangle that was neglected by the central government. The Beltran Leyva family would end up with 5 boys and 3 girls. Tragically, Doña Ramona died during childbirth. Arturo and his siblings were raised by their father from then on. The tight-knit family lived in a small, humble house. Don Carlos was a good father and a hard worker. Still, it was a struggle financially. As a young kid, Arturo always wanted a pair of nice boots, but the family was barely surviving, so a pair of handmade huaraches would have to do for the time being. The Beltran brothers had an older cousin living down the road in the nearby town of La Tuna, and just like La Palma, La Tuna was a tiny forgotten town whose people struggled to make ends meet. Their older cousin Joaquin, better known today as Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, was close with his Beltran Leyva cousins. In fact, it was Arturo that taught El Chapo how to plant his own marijuana field without his father's knowledge. The family made some money from a small marijuana field, but it wasn't much. For all their hard work, it still wasn't enough to change their standard of living. It is said that the Beltran boys could barely read, since schooling was difficult to attain while working the fields with their father. The Beltran brothers would eventually learn to read from their sisters, since they were able to attend school. For someone like Arturo, with his hard-scrabbled background, it was a choice between living in poverty like the past generations or striking out on his own. He was dissatisfied with how the family lived. In his early teens, he began working on larger marijuana fields as a laborer. It was through this line of work that he met Emilio Quintero Payan, an old-school trafficker, part of the infamous Quintero family. It was the mid-70s, and Operation Condor was in full swing. Army troops and federal police were rampaging through several areas of Mexico. On the surface, the operation was supposed to neutralize anti-government groups, specifically leftist insurgent organizations. However, the real goal of the federal government was to take the decentralized plaza system away from local authorities. The central government realized they were losing out on millions of dollars in bribe money. Federal police set out to take control of the plaza system and the growing amounts of money flowing in from the sale of drugs. Soldiers and judiciales carried out raids all over the Golden Triangle. Countless growers and traffickers were executed by federal forces. Even state and local cops were killed. Marijuana and poppy fields were being raided and product was being destroyed. It was a dangerous time for narcos. Rival gangs fought each other for suppliers. The army and federales hunted down uncooperative traffickers and anyone that associated with them. It was getting more difficult to make a decent living in La Palma. Arturo was known as a local marijuana grower. The federales and military would come looking for him sooner or later. It was time to relocate. Arturo knew there was another person who had similar ambitions to claim their stake in the world, his cousin Joaquin. Together, they set out to look for bigger opportunities. In 1976, Arturo and his cousin Joaquin decided to move to the small city of Badiraguato, and a short time later, the state capital of Culiacan. Soon after, Arturo would travel to Durango and Sonora to chase illicit opportunities. He joined a group of criminals that were in various schemes. It was in Durango where he was given a long prison sentence without sufficient money to bribe the judge and his refusal to turn informer. But a short time later, Arturo escaped prison using a revolver that was smuggled into his cell. Arturo made a living by any means necessary. He was hungry to climb the ladder. Sometimes he had money and sometimes he didn't. It was an especially dicey time for Arturo. The drug game was full of independent cowboys looking to make a name for themselves. At any time, he could be betrayed by associates. Dirty cops could decide to kill him and steal the small amount of drugs that he was moving at the time. Arturo made his bones as a pistolero, the classic entry-level job for many traficantes. He worked with a small-time crew, but soon he would join an organization that would propel him to the big times. In 1984, Arturo turned up in Zacatecas. In those days, the Guadalajara cartel was running a billion-dollar operation smuggling tons of weed and coke. The top bosses were originally from Sinaloa. One of them, Juan El Azul Esparagosa, brought Arturo to Zacatecas to manage one of the many farms growing massive amounts of mota for people like El Azul and others. Arturo was getting his first taste of drug trafficking on a massive scale. He knew heavyweight traffickers, people like El Azul, Emilio Quintero, and Amado Carrillo Fuentes. It is said that when Amado met Arturo, he was wearing his favorite white boots. For the longest, as a young kid, he could never afford a good pair of shoes. For most of his upbringing, he had to manage with his mom's homemade huaraches. When he was able to splurge after moving out of his hometown, a good pair of boots was one of the first things he bought. That's why his closest associates would sometimes refer to him as El Botas Blancas.
Camarino's body was found on a Mexican farm in 1985. He had been brutally tortured by drug barons trying to learn what American officials knew about Mexican corruption. A former senior DEA official today says Dr. Alvarez was present during the beatings and administered the drug lidocaine to keep Camarino alive during the brutal interrogation.
In 1985, DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena was kidnapped, tortured, and eventually killed in Guadalajara. Kiki had shut down one of the cartel's most important marijuana farms. The raid would end up costing the cartel more than $2 billion in profits. Rafael Caro Quintero's men, along with others, including high-level Mexican federal officials, were involved in his death. Tremendous pressure from the U.S. forced the Guadalajara traffickers to lay low and scatter. It wouldn't be long before people started to fall. Arturo kept working. He was by now in charge of a marijuana grow operation in Durango, working for the Quintero family. He wasn't on DEA's radar yet. He, along with his cousin El Chapo, were still among the many countless up-and-coming narcos working towards bigger responsibilities. If anyone was paying attention, they would have noticed that Arturo was known for running a tight ship. He had the respect of his fellow gunmen for letting his actions do all the talking. Also around this time, Arturo began working more with Amado Carrillo Fuentes. The only thing authorities would have to go by was talk of someone known as Arturo el de Culiacán, a tall, light-skinned, bearded Sinaloense from the rural mountains. Other than that, he was still unknown in the drug world. However, Arturo was never the type to be satisfied. He had ambition and a need to help his family. The Camarena situation created opportunities for traffickers to advance. Once the first wave of arrests took out the top bosses, like Fonseca and Caro Quintero, at the same time, the Chapo began to take a bigger role in the cartel. In 1987, Arturo arrived in Agua Prieta, Sonora. At the time, the Chapo was in charge of a crew that crossed shipments over that particular area for Emilio Quintero and Amado Carrillo. The Chapo called up his cousin and asked him to join his crew. They would be handling cocaine shipments flown in from Sinaloa and Cancun. Arturo accepted his cousin's offer to work together. He handled security at the airstrips and warehouses. Drivers would cross cocaine shipments hidden inside modified vans and trucks. It was usually a quick trip if the buyers were picking up in Arizona. But most of the time, it meant driving to California, usually to Los Angeles, where the organization had stash houses. The driver would normally pull into the garage and take a different car back to Agua Prieta with cash. Arturo also supervised the building of a clandestine runway near Cumpas, Sonora. Cocaine shipments were flown to Cumpas by the Chapo's pilots. Arturo was there with his brother Hector. Sometimes Arturo would sleep at the remote airstrips for days during big operations, making sure security was on point, fuel was at the ready, mechanics on standby. One night, they had more than 10 planes land, one after the other, touched down on the dusty runway. The Colombians, El Azul, Amado, and others were sending as much product as the crew could handle. The stakes were now higher. Arturo was one of El Chapo's most trusted lieutenants. He was on the rise along with his brothers. In 1989, El Padrino, Miguel Ángel Felix Gallardo, was arrested by federal police. The narco world would go through a transformation. After everything settled down, the new landscape included new bosses. Amado Carrillo was now in partial control of the Juarez Plaza. The Arellano Felix brothers operated in Tijuana. El Chapo ended up with Agua Prieta. From then on, the Beltran brothers were never without work.
Ahora el terreno está caliente, yo le doy de frente, me metí en el ambiente para cambiar mi suerte.
Their specialty was the meat and potatoes of any large trafficking operation, logistics. Arturo had begun to buy and sell his own cocaine shipments. By the early 90s, the Beltran brothers were now working full-time for Emilio Quintero and Amado Carrillo Fuentes directly. Arturo operated in the state of Sonora, Guerrero, and Sinaloa, among others. By now, his youngest brother Alfredo was also involved in the business. The days of poverty were now a thing of the past. Arturo and his brothers now had their own expensive houses, drove expensive foreign cars, sporting the latest designer brands. One of Arturo's dreams was to one day provide a life to his father that was unimaginable during his childhood in La Palma. He never forgot his roots. Arturo would usually visit his hometown and his father at least once a month. The brothers were known. They were gaining a reputation for running successful crews. They were on the rise in both money and power. And like many traffickers, it wouldn't be long before the first corridos based on their lives began to appear.
Que todos lo cantarán, son los versos de un amigo, de Arturo el de Culiacán, valiente y muy decidido, ustedes ya lo sabrán.
Between 1992 and 1993, three important events took place that would catapult Arturo to new heights. In 1992, Arturo made a deal with Hernán Gastelón, El Pelón, a representative of the Cali cartel, which meant access to wholesale cocaine. Arturo was now financing his own shipments directly from Colombia. The other two events took place in 1993, and that year, Amado Carrillo Fuentes officially took over the Juárez cartel. Arturo and Amado had known each other since the late 70s. Amado employed Arturo throughout the 80s. And now with his newfound power base secured, Amado placed Arturo in charge of several lucrative plazas throughout Mexico. Arturo had built a reputation for being reliable, honest, and a no-nonsense type of boss. With the backing of Amado, Arturo and his crew were now transporting massive amounts of cocaine. The third event was the capture of his cousin and close collaborator El Chapo, who was arrested in Guatemala in 1993. He was hiding out in the Central American country after the shootout at Guadalajara airport, which resulted in the death of the Archbishop Juan Jesus Posadas Ocampo. With his cousin in prison, Arturo was now operating without his close relative. But he never forgot Chapo. The two cousins had entered the drug trade at roughly the same time. Both had survived shootouts and government raids. El Chapo helped him climb the ladder. Now Arturo made sure his cousin and his family were taken care of while in prison. El Chapo left most of his day-to-day business to his brother, El Pollo Guzman. Arturo helped El Pollo by moving his drug shipments along the same routes he controlled. With the blessing of Amado, Arturo transported Chapo's coke and made regular visits to El Chapo or his brother, always bringing duffel bags filled with millions in profits. It was thanks to Arturo and his brothers that El Chapo remained a force within the narco world. Arturo made Guerrero one of his bases in the early 90s, controlling the movement of shipments coming straight from Colombia. His crew would usually unload the boats right on the beach at night, or the larger boats would wait off the coast, where Arturo's fast boats would go to meet them and bring the merchandise back. It was during a party in Guerrero where Arturo met Los Tigres del Norte for the first time. Eventually, the band would produce a famous corrido dedicated to Arturo and his line of work. In 1993, Pacas de Aquilo was released. One of his closest associates was his compadre, Albino Quintero Meraz. Albino was a smuggler operating on the Sonora-Arizona border. He smuggled drugs for whoever paid him. But most importantly, Albino was also a cousin, one of Arturo's mentors, Emilio Quintero Payan. At the time, he was having problems with the Arellano brothers. At one point, the brothers put $1 million bounty on his head. Arturo recruited Albino in 1992. The new team member moved to Veracruz and later Quintana Roo in order to personally take charge of Colombian cocaine shipments landing on the coast. Arturo took his compadre under his wing for a bit, showing him how to properly move multi-ton shipments north to Juárez. Albino turned out to be excellent at his new job. He operated in Veracruz and Quintana Roo. At the time, the governor of Quintana Roo was Mario Villanueva, who got along well with the trafficker. Arturo was now operating all over the country. He had plazas in Guerrero, Nuevo León, Sinaloa, Sonora, Nayarit, Colima, and Mexico City. He was a central piece in the trafficking empire led by Amado Carrillo Fuentes. In the 90s, Arturo and his brothers kept moving tons of weight north. One of his aliases was El Jefe de las Plazas. The fact was, the moniker fit reality. He was in charge of so many different plazas, probably more than any other jefe working for Amado Carrillo at the time. By 1996, Arturo was even working with the Golf Cartel in Tamaulipas, using the Nuevo Laredo port of entrance and and others to ship merchandise north. Then in 1997, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, the boss of the Juarez cartel, died in a Mexico City hospital after a botched operation. The cartel was left in chaos, and for several months there was a war over leadership. When the dust finally settled, the majority of crews aligned themselves with Amado's brother, Vicente. Arturo never contested leadership. He had too much respect for Amado to go to war against his brother. Besides, he always had his own slice of the business. He still worked with the Carrillo family, but by the late 90s, he was an independent trafficker, running his own crews and supplying his own distributors in the US. 1997 was also the year Arturo's name appeared for the first time in an official intelligence report. In 1998, Arturo was introduced to Harold Poveda, a Colombian working for the Norte de Valle cartel. Poveda would eventually become the main cocaine supplier to the Beltran Leyva brothers. By the time the new millennium arrived, Mexico voted out the PRI, the ruling party that had governed the country since the revolution. Big changes were coming for the country. A new era of violence would turn the problem of drug trafficking into an issue of national security. In 2001, fearing extradition to the US, El Chapo escaped prison and went into hiding. It would be several months before the heat died down. Meanwhile, El Chapo called a meeting with drug bosses from the Pacific coast. Almost all of them were Sinaloenses. The goal was to establish a federation of powerful organizations, all sharing resources, cooperating, and reaping the rewards of being able to move drug shipments throughout the country without hassle from the government. Bosses like El Mayo, the Beltran brothers, Nacho Coronel, the Amezcua brothers, El Azul Esparagosa, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, and others attended the meeting. By the end of it all, a new federation had taken shape. Members agreed to cooperate and share resources. Arturo approved of the new organization. After all, the Chapo was his cousin, and in Sinaloa, and really throughout all of Mexico, blood ties are key to any agreement, especially in the narco world. 2001, Arturo recruited a former federal cop from Coahuila, Sergio Villarreal Barragan, also known as El Grande, for his stature of 6'7". El Grande started working for the Juarez cartel, and then joined Arturo in his organization. In time, he would become one of Arturo's most important lieutenants. In 2002, his compadre, Albino Quintero, was apprehended by soldiers in Veracruz. The info going around was that his own cartel gave up his location to the government. The problem was that Albino was too good at what he did. The top Juarez bosses found out that he was also transporting Gulf cartel merchandise without telling anyone, keeping the profits for himself while using Juarez cartel runways and crews. By 2002, the Sinaloa cartel, specifically El Chapo, made the decision to begin expanding and taking over territory. This meant war with other organizations. One of the first battles was with the Tijuana cartel, but instead of launching an all-out assault with sicarios, corrupt federales, and soldiers were used to arrest CAF members and raid safe houses all over Baja California. The Arellano's were still rebuilding from the war with the Juarez cartel 5 years earlier. This war, however, would end the total control of the Arellano Felix brothers over Baja California and even parts of Tijuana itself. After the death of Ramon Arellano and the capture of his brother Benjamin, a few months later, the Sinaloa cartel began taking bigger portions of Baja California. In 2002, Arturo became involved in a dispute between Mexican and Colombian traffickers. The brothers Mario El MP and Alberto El Borrado were from Guerrero. Mario's brother Alberto had been kidnapped in Colombia by traffickers. Alberto owed a large drug debt of $5 million and had yet to pay up. In response to his brother's kidnapping, Mario and his gunmen kidnapped a pair of Colombians related to the group responsible for taking Alberto. After a few phone calls, an agreement was hashed out and all hostages were returned alive and well. Although the brothers were originally working with El Mayo's crew, they ended up working for Arturo Beltran. El MP and El Borrado were thankful for his help in pulling strings with the Colombians during negotiations. Arturo placed the Pineda brothers, specifically Alberto, in charge of unloading coke shipments from submarines and ships stationed off the coasts of Guerrero and Chiapas. The Sinaloa cartel soon after turned its attention to Nuevo Laredo, a crown jewel within the Plaza system. It was recently taken over by the Gulf cartel and its army of Zetas. The Zetas' reputation for brutality was beginning to spread throughout Mexico. This did not stop the Sinaloan bosses from making the decision to take Nuevo Laredo by any means. Although Arturo had second thoughts about starting a war with his Gulf cartel associates, at the end of the day, the Chapo was family, and El Mayo was a longtime friend and business partner. Arturo was all in. In 2003, Arturo and his family were living near Mexico City at the time when the bosses agreed to take control of Nuevo Laredo. They all agreed Arturo should be in charge of the war. After all, he had more contacts in Nuevo León and Tamaulipas than all of the other bosses. And to lead the troops in the field, Arturo had one person in mind. The year before, Arturo hosted a party at his rancho just south of Mexico City. That was the day Arturo was introduced to a young trafficker born and raised in Texas, but now living in Monterrey. His name was Edgar Valdez Villarreal, better known as La Barbie. According to La Barbie, there was tons of beer and expensive whiskey, cook making fresh corn tortillas, and only the best cuts of beef. La Barbie was there to talk business. At the time, he was being hunted by Zetas and their Gulf cartel bosses, who were now in charge of the Nuevo Laredo plaza. Arturo took a liking to the American trafficker, especially after La Barbie sent Arturo 2 prized horses. He agreed to step in and help mediate a truce between the Gulf cartel boss, Jose Cardenas, and La Barbie. The two began working together. Then when the decision came down to wage war and conquer Nuevo Laredo, La Barbie was put in charge of the troops on the ground. In March 2003, soon after Jose Cardenas was captured by the military in Matamoros, sensing weakness and in preparation for the upcoming war, Arturo and La Barbie traveled to Mexico City to personally deliver a $1.5 million bribe to the director of the AFI at the time, Domingo Gonzalez Diaz, who in return sent Comandante Adolfo Ruiz to Nuevo Laredo to assist the Sinaloans in their fight against the Gulf cartel. Under the leadership of Arturo, La Barbie began moving hundreds of gunmen into Nuevo Laredo and the surrounding areas. He recruited seasoned gunmen and ruthless Mara Salvatrucha gang members. The gunmen were stationed in safe houses and motels and would come out at night launching sporadic and clandestine attacks, attacking and killing Gulf cartel soldiers, operators at the lower and mid levels. At first, it took Los Zetas and Gulf cartel some time to notice something strange happening. Stash houses were being hit and robbed. City cops on their payroll began dying or disappearing. It kept taking hit after hit by gunmen dressed in matching dark uniforms, armed with automatic weapons and armored SUVs, roaming, striking without warning, and targeting Gulf cartel operators. Rumors began to circulate about a new force known as Los Lobos, but later on they would be better known as Los Negros. The Gulf cartel found out about the corrupt Ruiz, and 2 months later he was killed by a Zeta hit team. Hours after Ruiz was killed, Los Negros began sending threats over Gulf cartel radio frequencies. Get ready, cause we're already here. We're with El Chapo, so hold on tight. We're gonna f you up. Long live Sinaloa. El Chapo and Arturo were determined to take Nuevo Laredo after Ruiz's death. The cartel deployed their Zeta forces, determined to defend Nuevo Laredo. Los Zetas hunted their rivals. Heriberto Lascano and commanders like El Caris and Miguel Ángel Trevino were in the field commanding Zeta teams and patrolling their city and the outskirts. It was a brutal, long fight. There were weekly shootouts at the height of the violence. Arturo's forces numbered around 200 to 300 gunmen embedded within the city, usually coming out at night. Special teams were assigned to assassinate city police on the payroll of the Gulf cartel. It was understood among the Sinaloan forces that being captured or kidnapped by Los Zetas was worse than death. They were known to brutally torture their victims for days before finally killing them in one of the most brutal ways, being doused in gasoline and lit on fire while still alive, or being taken apart limb by limb until the head was finally chopped off. For months, the war dragged on. Targeted assassinations of cops and enemies continued. Sicarios were killed in ambushes or simply abducted and never seen again. But after some time, neither side was able to fully defeat the other. The Zetas, meanwhile, sent forces down to Guerrero and Morelos. They knew Guerrero was a Beltran Leyva stronghold and a key plaza for importing Colombian cocaine. Zetas began killing cops on the Beltran Leyva payroll throughout the state. They were bringing the war close to home for Arturo. At the time, his family resided in an upscale area of Monterrey, and later the capital, Mexico City. La Barbie was just as brutal as Los Zetas. For example, there was the incident in May 2005. 2 Zeta hit teams arrived in the city and Zihuatanejo to kidnap Sinaloa cartel members. However, almost as soon as they arrived, they were on the cartel's radar. What the Zeta teams failed to realize was that almost all the major hotels had lookouts working for the Beltran Leyva brothers. It could be the bellhop, front desk, cooks, maintenance. At some hotels, there was several dozen, always aware, making notes of large groups of men. So when the team of Zetas arrived in Zihuatanejo, they were immediately rounded up by local police, then handed over to Beltran Leyva gunmen. The team in Acapulco was also captured soon after arriving. The captured gunmen were then taken to La Barbie's mansion for further interrogation. In an infamous video, which some consider the first narco execution video made public, the 4-man hit team sit on the floor on top of plastic sheets. La Barbie, who doesn't appear on camera, asks questions about their operations. After some time, he's finally gotten everything out of them, then stands up, walks over to the leader, puts the barrel of his silver revolver up to his temple, and squeezes. This was just the first wave of of operations against Arturo's forces on his home turf. Several months later, the assistant director of state police was killed by a Zeta hit team. His bodyguard was kidnapped but later released. Bruised but still alive from his hospital bed, he relayed a message from his kidnappers. They told me to tell you that they are already here in Guerrero with 120 Zeta soldiers from Tamaulipas. Greetings from Mr. Goya Sauceda, and long live Tamaulipas. It was now the Zeta's turn to inflict damage on Arturo's plaza. Hit-and-run attacks began against Sinaloa cartel members. Stash houses were hit, shipments were stolen, and then in February 2006, the Beltran Plaza chief in Acapulco, Carlos Esteban Landeros, was executed by cops, suspected of working for the Gulf Cartel. Months later, the police commanders in charge of the operation were tracked down and killed by Beltran Leyva gunmen. After the death of Landeros, Arturo placed La Barbie in charge of Acapulco. He instructed La Barbie to form a new paramilitary group known as Los Pelones, whose main job was to secure Guerrero and hunt down Zeta operatives. The summer of 2006 would be an especially bloody time for Guerrero. It was a contest for which group could be more brutal than the other. One week, Zetas would dump severed heads. The next, Arturo and his gunmen would return the favor by dumping Zeta body parts. The war in Guerrero eventually died down by late 2006. Gulf Cartel forces were being stretched thin. They were fighting battles in Tamaulipas and were now at war with La Familia Michoacana. Arturo had retained control of Guerrero. The war for Nuevo Laredo also died down. Neither side was able to defeat the other, and eventually, the Sinaloan forces withdrew. One reason for Arturo's success was his ability to corrupt the right people. The thing about drug trafficking in Mexico is that the whole system relies on corruption at the highest levels of the government. Arturo and his brothers were effective at bribing law enforcement officials. During this era, with the help of his brothers Hector and Alfredo, the Beltran brothers were on a roll. Money was pouring in. With the help of a strong crew made up of cold killers and effective traffickers, like their cousin Jerónimo Gámez Garcia, the Piñera Villa brothers, Jesus Nava Romero, aka El Rojo, Comandante Magaña, El Buche, El Chaguín, La Barbie, El Grande, and Chapo Isidro. In the mid-2000s, Arturo was riding high. The people from his hometown remember those days fondly. Arturo and Alfredo would frequently give out money to needy families. Alfredo was especially well known. He loved to party, was a big music fan. In fact, there are several recordings of him singing some of his favorite corridos at private parties he held. Arturo, meanwhile, was less well known outside the trafficking industry. Only those within that world knew what kind of power Arturo had, the power to corrupt at the highest levels. The bribes Arturo handed out to government officials could be anywhere from $25,000 to several $100 million. In fact, the infamous case of Zenli Gongyi, the Chinese businessman whose mansion was raided in 2007 by Mexican agents, in which led to the largest cash seizure of drug money amounting to over $205 million, was Arturo's money. The bust of the century was the largest ever involving drug money. Arturo gave it to the government of Felipe Calderón. After the discovery of the cash, Arturo complained to an associate, those crooks. It was originally $300 million. The agents that discovered the money stole over $90 million for themselves. Sometime later, those same agents were kidnapped, tortured, and found dead. One of the most important officials in the pocket of Arturo was Genaro Garcia Luna, the head of the federal police. Back then, they were known as AFI. Arturo sent him a massive $50 million bribe and then kept paying him a monthly bribe of anywhere from $1 to $1.5 million. In September 2006, there was a meeting held in Culiacán between Arturo and Del Mayo with the objective of figuring out how to install Garcia Luna as the new secretary of public security for Mexico. It was a windy night in Culiacán as a convoy of black SUVs raced through the streets of the Sinaloan capital. The convoy stopped in front of a large house in the Quintas neighborhood. El Grande was the first to descend, followed by 6 bodyguards, all heavily armed. Then Arturo stepped out, quickly scanned the area, and began walking towards the front door. Before he could knock, the door opened, and the group made their way towards the main living room. Sitting on a leather couch, surrounded by 3 bodyguards, was El Mayo. The 2 bosses greeted each other with smiles and a strong handshake. El Mayo and Arturo poured drinks from a bottle of Buchanan whiskey, while the group relaxed and made small talk. Although known for being outgoing and having a strong personality, Arturo, out of habit, liked to enjoy his first drink in solitude before he got down to business. As soon as he was ready, a subtle nod to his chief of security El Grande meant his bodyguards could vacate the room. Only El Grande remained for the meeting. El Mayo did the same. Arturo got straight to the point. He asked El Mayo how they should go about making sure the newly elected president, Felipe Calderón, placed their man Garcia Luna as the new Secretary of Security. What's the strategy, he asked. El Mayo, with a sly smile, simply responded, money. Well, how do we get close to Calderón? Responded Arturo, knowing very well that a substantial bribe was the least of their problems. They needed an insider to influence Calderón. El Mayo, still smirking, first poured himself another drink before pointing to El Grande and saying, there's your answer right there. El Grande, who was sitting in the corner lighting a cigarette, was caught off guard. Along with Arturo, El Mayo went on to explain, he is the key to getting close to Calderón and making sure Garcia Luna is placed in that position. El Grande, meanwhile, had only one thought at that moment. I had no idea how Mayo thought I could get close enough to Calderón, let alone install Garcia Luna to one of the most important cabinet positions of the presidency. But soon enough, everything would make sense. El Mayo was a man of few words, but solid ideas. With Arturo and El Grande's full attention, El Mayo went on to explain. Calderón had a small circle he confided in, and he took advice from that circle. One of those people within that group that was close to Calderón was Guillermo Anaya Llamas. When El Mayo said that name, everything made sense. Anaya was the brother-in-law of El Grande's brother, Adolfo. Anaya and El Grande had a good friendship. Now the job of getting close to the president-elect seemed not only doable, but a sure bet. After that, nothing was left to discuss. They were all in agreement. El Grande was in charge of the whole operation, and with that matter settled, Arturo poured some drinks and walked over to El Grande to hand him a glass of whiskey. Arturo made a toast, and all three were in good spirits, positive that the plan would work. The meeting lasted no more than half an hour. Arturo and El Mayo said their goodbyes, hugged, and wished each other luck. El Mayo then turned to El Grande and said he had confidence in his ability to get the results they wanted. And with that, Arturo and his group boarded their SUVs and sped towards the airport. El Grande was sitting in the same SUV as his boss, Arturo. Little was said between them on the ride to the airport. While en route, El Grande immediately got to work. He called his compadre, Anaya. He was direct. He wanted him to talk to Calderón. Anaya agreed to help and said the best opportunity to have this conversation with Calderón was at the baptism of his daughter, which would take place in Torreón on the 25th of September. Calderón and his wife were the godparents of his infant daughter. Anaya invited El Grande to the event. The call was brief. As soon as it ended, he turned to Arturo. It's done, Jefe. Within a short time, I'll meet with the president. You can be sure Luna Garcia will be our Secretary of Security. Arturo answered with a slight grin as the convoy proceeded towards the airport. After Calderón officially took office in December of that same year, he appointed Garcia Luna as Secretary of Public Safety. The Sinaloan traffickers had accomplished a great victory. Garcia Luna proved to be a valuable ally. He warned Arturo and other Beltran Leyva members of raids, but also just as important, he gave up snitches working within the organization. In 2007, Arturo started losing drug shipments that were already bought and paid for. The U.S. Coast Guard was somehow at the right place and right time after time, taking down cargo ships and even submarines loaded with Arturo's coke. Someone was leaking info. Arturo wanted Garcia Luna to find the leak. After some digging around, Garcia Luna tracked down the snitch. It turned out to be a Colombian associate. He had turned DEA informant after an arrest in Miami the previous year. He was the reason for the interdictions. Garcia Luna's deputy, Luis Cardenas Palomino, was sent to a meeting called by Arturo. Palomino pulled out a folder with info and a recent picture of the informant. Arturo wasted no time. He ordered El Borrado to find and kidnap the Colombian informant, who was eventually kidnapped in Cuernavaca. He would end up tortured and eventually killed. However, there were still setbacks out of their control. One example was the takedown of the Catún cargo ship in February 2007. A pair of Mexican nationals arrived in Panama City. As far as anyone knew, they were businessmen involved in the buying and selling of cargo ships. They paid $3 million for the ship Catún. Soon after they arrived, an informant tipped off local Panamanian authorities about the businessmen. Turns out the ship Catún was secretly owned by El Mayo. In March, Arturo bought a large shipment of coke from Harold Poveda, his main cocaine supplier in Colombia. Arturo brought El Mayo and the Chapo in on the deal, which totaled more than 20 tons of cocaine. He then borrowed El Mayo's ship in order to transport the merchandise. On March 18, 2007, as the Catún was traveling off the coast of Panama, it was intercepted by the U.S. Coast Guard. The coke was confiscated and the ship seized. Arturo blamed one of El Mayo's lieutenants, El Capi Beto. He was the man on the ground in charge of bringing the coke to Mexico. But even 20 tons was just another shipment, another setback quickly written off as just part of the business. That same year, Arturo agreed to a ceasefire with the Gulf Cartel and Los Zetas after years of fighting. This agreement did not sit well with El Chapo, who despised the Zetas. It would be a sign of things to come. It is said that El Chapo was becoming weary of Arturo's growing power and his decision to not only make peace with the Gulf Cartel, but he also began to allow them to fly in shipments through his territory. It didn't help matters when El Grande was put in charge of the Mexico City airport, a key transportation hub for cocaine shipments arriving straight from Colombia. El Grande was a violent individual and not the type to use diplomacy to settle his problems. One time, he ordered his sicarios to abduct several airport workers and managers for losing a shipment. Their heads were later found dumped on the street near the airport. In another incident, he blocked the release of a large shipment of pseudoephedrine belonging to El Chapo. El Grande told El Chapo's men, "Nothing leaves until El Jefe gives the go-ahead." El Chapo was furious. He eventually got his shipment after calling Arturo. "Sorry, compadre. Next time, just let my people know when you're expecting a shipment to avoid misunderstandings." Arturo's response didn't help. Chapo felt like Arturo was treating him like a junior associate. Things got worse between the two sides when El Mochomo started bragging about the incident. Soon after, Arturo began to notice the federal police were hitting Beltran Leyva safe houses more often, usually after meeting El Chapo and El Mayo. He began to suspect his cousin was the one unleashing the federal dogs on his people. Tension was building between Arturo and his cousin, especially when El Chapo heard in late 2007 that Arturo was now collaborating with Los Zetas, supplying them with coke, even bringing them to Sinaloa for certain business deals. Like all empires, eventually they crumble, and the Federation was no exception. 2008, an incident took place that would alter the path and lives of the top bosses, and it would unleash a new era of violence in Mexico. January 21st, 2008 was a breezy day, and for Alfredo Beltran Leyva, it was just another day. El Mochomo, as he was known, had gone to a white and red residence located in the north of Culiacan to spend time with one of his girlfriends. At around 7 a.m., Alfredo, along with his 3 bodyguards, jumped into his white BMW X3 and began to leave the house. Only a few blocks later, they were pulled over by police. Thinking they were rookie cops, unaware of his arrangements with the chief, he offered no resistance. El Mochomo thought it was a simple mix-up, and with a few phone calls, they would be on their way. But when he saw the large number of soldiers surrounding them, he realized this was serious. These were not local cops, they were federales. He was immediately placed in handcuffs, along with his bodyguards. Arturo was relaxing in his mansion in Morelos when he learned the news. He was enraged and reacted by grabbing his gun and shooting into the ceiling. How could this happen? Those bastards. What do we pay these crooks millions for? It was a bad time around Culiacan, and really, all over Mexico. The Beltranes were heavyweights in the entire drug supply, between South American coke, Mexican distributors, and American consumers. The Beltran Leyva family was moving enormous amounts of product. They were efficient, and for the most part, operated under the radar, without attracting too much media attention. The Beltran brothers weren't just involved in one aspect of the business. They were veteran money launderers, controlled key airports and cities. They had dozens of major distributors inside the US. They were connected to the highest levels of the federal government. That same day, El Grande, who was in Puebla, took a helicopter to a meeting with Arturo and Hector in Morelos. Arturo was angry and looking for answers. The brothers paid a hefty amount every month for political protection, and one of the key points of these agreements was that family members would be left alone. El Grande was given the task of finding out who gave the order to arrest El Mochomo and the people involved in the plan. Within hours, El Grande was on the phone, ringing up his contacts in the federal government and armed forces. At the headquarters of CIDO, the staff at the office of the Assistant Attorney General were aware of the coming arrest, but by then, it was too late to alert the Beltran Leyvas. The people in the know were certain their boss would get a call soon. In the evening, Intelligence Director Fernando Rivera got that call. El Grande wanted answers. He wanted to know everything about the operation, if any informants were involved. Arturo is pissed. He wants to know who he's gonna have to kill. El Grande continued, everyone received money from him, and no one notified him of the arrest of his brother. You have 24 hours to get the info. Within 24 hours, Rivera had the answers. He met with El Grande in an upscale restaurant in the Polanco area of Mexico City. Rivera handed over documents and photos of informants within the local police department that helped in the operation, and some of the military and federal officers' names. He claimed Cido and Garcia Luna had only known about the operation right before El Mochomo was stopped. They had no time to react. At the orders of Arturo, El Grande was to get $10 million ready in order to bribe the Special Forces soldiers and federal agents guarding the facility where Alfredo was being held. He made plans to assemble 150 gunmen and break him out using armored SUVs and trucks. During the planning stage, Arturo asked El Chapo and El Mayo for help. Both traffickers thought it would bring too much heat on the organization. In their opinion, the plan had little chance of succeeding. The rescue operation was ultimately called off when El Mochomo was transferred to a more secure prison. But the refusal of El Mayo, and especially El Chapo, made Arturo rethink their alliance. Arturo began to suspect someone within the cartel had given the go-ahead to the federal government. He began to suspect his own cousin Chapo. Arturo began to prepare for a possible war with his former partners. As weeks turned into months, Arturo began to lose hope of ever freeing his brother. His government contacts tried to calm him down. They argued it was now best to bribe a judge and get the case thrown out, but he knew it wouldn't be that easy. The government would be taking a huge slap in the face if Mochomo was let go. Any suspicions that plagued Arturo about the whole situation were confirmed on April 12, 2008. That was the day Ivan Archibaldo Guzman, El Chapo's son and heir to his empire, was suddenly released from prison. In Arturo's mind, this was the reason his brother was in jail. El Chapo had given up Mochomo in exchange for his son's freedom. For Arturo, nothing is worse than betrayal. To him, loyalty is written in blood. How could his own cousin betray him? Not only were they family, the two cousins came from the same humble beginnings. Both had climbed up the ladder, putting in work, surviving shootouts and police raids. It was thanks to Arturo that El Chapo was able to stay in the game when he was locked up, faithfully bringing his compadre bags full of cash, making sure his family on the outside was taken care of. When there was a problem and Chapo and Mayo needed muscle, Arturo and his people were always there to take the war to their enemies. And this is what he gets in return? Arturo was disillusioned, but more angry than anything. Shortly after he heard the news of Ivan being released, he called El Chapo and accused him of selling out his brother. El Chapo denied it, and to this day still claims he had nothing to do with the arrest of El Mochomo. El Mayo, El Azul, Damaso Lopez, and other high-ranking bosses tried to get Arturo to calm down, but to no avail. Arturo was close to all of his brothers, but he was especially close with his baby brother, Alfredo. His arrest was especially painful. Arturo was now snorting coke and drinking more often. A few days after Ivan's release, Arturo called a meeting, but this time it was to gather all Beltran Leyva family members. He explained the situation and told them all to leave Culiacan and Sinaloa. He would place them in new homes. He said it was because things were about to heat up and didn't want any family members caught in the crossfire. Most Beltran Leyva members moved to one of three cities: Acapulco, Mexico City, and Cuernavaca, places where Arturo could guarantee their safety. On the street, the tension was noticeable. Crews of gunmen who just weeks earlier were working together now stayed away from each other. Beltran Leyva crews began to distance themselves from Chapo's people and vice versa. Everyone could sense where things were going. Chapo and Mayo met somewhere in Sinaloa. El Chapo told Mayo war was coming. No one could do anything to stop it. He also told his compadre he was receiving reports from his people that Arturo Beltran was now allied with Los Zetas and the Carrillo Fuentes family. Arturo was also infiltrating gunmen into Culiacan itself in preparation for the conflict, with the aim of killing El Chapo and El Mayo. El Mayo told El Chapo, "Let me talk to him one more time. Maybe I can reason with him and stop all of this. Last thing we need is another war." Chapo said he didn't want war either, but he's got it in his head that I turned in his brother. At the end of the meeting, El Mayo said he would talk to Arturo one last time. El Mayo called Arturo. "How is it possible, with you being El Chapo's cousin and a close friend of mine that I've known all my life, how you could just destroy everything?" Arturo said it was because he knew El Chapo and El Mayo were responsible for his brother's arrest, but his beef wasn't with El Mayo. His problem was with El Chapo. It was El Chapo who sacrificed Alfredo in order to have his son Ivan released from prison. El Mayo tried to reason with him. "Don't listen to rumors. It's all lies." But by this time, Arturo was using drugs more regularly. One day he would be sober and call Mayo to tell him he knew it wasn't their fault and that he had no beef with them. A couple days later, he'd call again under the influence, yelling and ranting the opposite and promising to kill them both. Arturo at the same time was buying up houses all over the state, houses that were used as bases for the gunmen that were being recruited to fight against El Mayo and Chapo. The Beltran Leyvas gathered an army of several hundred sicarios, mostly local Sinaloans, but there were many that refused to align with Arturo as soon as they found out who they were going to fight. Mayo and El Chapo had more influence in Sinaloa than the Beltranes. Arturo had more influence in southern and central Mexico. El Chapo and Mayo began to receive warnings from those same people the Beltranes tried to recruit. The two bosses learned about what Arturo was up to. But before the recruitment of large numbers of sicarios, Arturo began to call up his associates. He needed to know whose side they were on. Both Chapo and Arturo did this. They both got in touch personally with enforcers, distributors, managers, mid-level associates, local and federal cops, military commanders, and politicians. It was time to choose a side, which wasn't easy for a lot of people. Right after El Mochomo's arrest, Arturo called Manuel Fernandez Valencia, also known as El Animal. Valencia was a trafficker originally from Michoacan. He got along well with both sides, but he was initially working with El Mochomo. Soon after El Mochomo was detained, Arturo called Valencia and told him, "I need to talk to you in Mexico City. If you don't show up, I'll kill you and your family." Valencia knew Arturo was more than capable of this, so he left immediately for Mexico City. He traveled in 2 armored SUVs with 2 prostitutes. He figured if this was the end for him, he might as well enjoy one last good time with alcohol and women. At the meeting, Arturo made 2 things clear. Valencia had 15 days to give him an answer, and if he chose the opposing side, Arturo would kill him first. Needless to say, Valencia felt cornered. Even though in the beginning he was working with El Mochomo, but now he had more business transactions with El Chapo and Mayo. He ultimately decided to stay loyal to Arturo's enemies. Valencia would later pay a heavy price for his decision. El Chapo and Mayo were also busy calling and reaching out to the same people as Arturo. Both sides were in a race against time. Everyone involved in the business, from middle management to federal commanders and politicians, had to choose a side. Even the Flores twins, who were major coke distributors from Chicago, had to choose a side. El Mayo received word from his military contact, General Humberto Antimo. Antimo told El Mayo that even within the army, generals and other commanders were choosing sides. The war would not just claim the lives of traffickers. This would be an all-out war within the cartel, as well within the police, the military, and even between politicians. It would be a war worse than anything Mexico had ever seen. All the pieces were set for conflict, and the spark that lit the fuse took place on April 30th, 2008. It was Dia de los Niños, and Vicente Zumbada would help initiate the conflict. For weeks, El Mayo's son Vicente and El Chapo's cousin Juancho were busy gathering info on safe houses by Beltran Leyva sicarios. Once they had a long list of addresses, gave it to the PFP commander stationed in Culiacan. El Chapo and Mayo had a deal with the commander weeks earlier. The PFP forces would raid the safe houses and arrest Beltran Leyva sicarios. On that day, they raided 5 houses. The first 4, everyone surrendered without much violence, but on the 5th, the Federales were met with automatic gunfire. After a 4-hour battle, 13 Beltran Leyva gunmen were taken into custody. A different unit of Leyva gunmen attacked some of El Chapo's in a different part of the city. As soon as they heard what was going on, the war was officially on. At the same time, another group of Beltran Leyva forces made their way towards a high-level target, Vicente Zumbada. And Mayo's oldest son, and heir to his empire, was celebrating the day at his villa on the outskirts of Culiacan. It was a family event. His kids, nephews, in-laws, and family friends were all there enjoying the day, while the state capital was in the middle of a war. Vicente was aware of the chaos in the city, but he felt more or less safe. There were at least 8 bodyguards posted nearby at all times. And then there were the outer security ring guarding the road leading to the property. Vicente was in constant communication with his security. Then, in the evening, he got word of a large convoy leaving Culiacan and heading north towards the small town of La Presita, where Vicente and his family were celebrating the day. 15 minutes later, there was no doubt where it was headed. The Beltran Leyva convoy clashed with Vicente's security guarding the main road. A huge firefight began. Vicente yelled to his kids and his wife and the rest of the guests to run inside the house. With a radio in one hand and his own handgun at the ready, he received constant reports of the situation. His personal bodyguards were posted all around the house in case the enemy broke through the front line. His security radioed with the news that they were engaged with the enemy and had already called for backup from the surrounding area. When the shootout was over, 4 enemy sicarios were dead and 2 of Vicente's gunmen were wounded. The Beltran Leyva gunmen never reached the house where Vicente and his guests were located. By the end of that that hectic day, there were more than a dozen dead sicarios and police. It was later discovered that some of the dead gunmen were off-duty state cops working for Arturo Beltran. The following day, various attacks against PFP units were launched by Beltran Leyva, Zeta, and Carrillo Fuentes gunmen. Some of the attackers were other cops. Arturo and his enemies had two types of targets: fellow traffickers and the officers that were in their pocket. One of the first high-level police commanders to fall was Roberto Velasco, who was on the side of Arturo Beltran. The day after the massive shootouts in Culiacan, El Mayo ordered one of his most trusted hitmen to eliminate Velasco. Around 6 in the evening, after a long day at work, Comandante Velasco was pulling into his driveway when a hitman appeared out of nowhere and fired 3 rounds into his head. Garcia Luna and Deputy Edgar Vallardo had sold out their own colleague to El Mayo's people. A few days later, Arturo responded. On May 2nd, Francisco Hernandez, a federal cop that was previously stationed in Cancun, was kidnapped and killed in Tamaulipas. In his previous post, he allowed planes belonging to El Mayo and the Chapo to land without problems at Cancun International Airport. On the same day, another member of Garcia Luna's team, Aristeo Gomez, was talking to a female colleague while sitting in his car on a public street in Mexico City. When several gunmen showed up in a van, they dragged Gomez out of his car, and when he resisted, they killed him. 30 cops were being hit all over the country. On May 4th, Arturo made a move to eliminate the Chapo's people from the coast of Guerrero, cutting off their access to the sea, making it more difficult to unload submarines and larger ships off the coast. On that day, a 70-member assault team invaded the city of Petatlan, Guerrero. They had one goal: to kill Rogaciano Alba. Alba was the leader of the powerful Landowners Association in that area, but that was a cover for his real power. He was El Chapo's man in Guerrero. His team was dedicated to the planting and harvesting of marijuana and poppy fields. He was also in charge of unloading ships off the coast and storing the coke in nearby warehouses. That day, the assault teams ended up killing most of Rogaciano's kids and some of his extended family. Most of his team was also killed. Arturo had neutralized El Chapo's power in Guerrero. Rogaciano escaped the assault, but he would later come out of hiding, announcing he had created a new group dedicated to eliminating the Beltran Leyvas and their Zeta allies in Guerrero. Over the next year, he fought an intense guerrilla war against the Beltran Leyva forces. During the war, Garcia Luna and his inner circle were involved in helping different sides. Very often they were helping both sides at the same time. Individuals like Federal Police Commissioner Edgar Millan, Commander Victor Garay, Comandante Edgar Vallardo, Comandante Francisco Navarro, and the Director of the Federal Police itself, Luis Palomino, were instrumental in taking down high-level bosses on both sides. Just depended on who paid the highest amount. By the end of the war, some would end up dead. Among the cops on the Chapo and El Mayo side was Edgar Millan. He was involved in the arrest of El Mochomo. On May 7th, Millan went after Arturo. That day, Arturo was traveling south towards Acapulco. His SUV was escorted by 4 other armored SUVs. They had no idea, just down the highway, a trap was set by Millan. He was tipped off by El Mayo Zumbada. A force of federal cops was assembled and stationed by the toll area to wait for the passing convoy. As the convoy approached, one of the cops tried to get it to stop, but the group sped up instead. It turned into a chase. At one point, the last SUV stopped to block the road and engage the chasing units. The rest of the convoy was able to escape. It was a close call. Now Arturo knew Millan was on the Chapo side. The response was quick. Within hours, Millan would be dead. In the early morning hours of May 8th, a Beltran Leyva hit team ambushed Millan when he was returning to his condo in Mexico City. He was hit 8 times. The crime shocked the country and the government, but Arturo meant business. He wasn't giving a pass to no one. Within days, the government held a memorial service to remember a loyal and outstanding law enforcement official, which in reality was operating at the orders of the country's most powerful drug traffickers. But before the day was over, at the other end of the country, in Culiacan, one of the biggest losses for El Chapo would take place in a mall parking lot. It was around 8:30 p.m. when Edgar Guzman Lopez, who was one of El Chapo's sons, pulled into the parking lot of the City Club supermarket located in Tres Rios, an upscale neighborhood of malls and mansions. Edgar had been running errands with his wife, earlier in the day and decided to meet up with friends later at night. Unfortunately for Edgar, he left behind his radio at home, which at the time was sending out alerts of Beltran Leyva sicarios roaming the area. After exiting his armored Ford Lobo, he began talking with friends while his wife Frida went inside the supermarket to shop for a planned Mother's Day celebration. Several minutes later, a large convoy of gunmen spotted Edgar. Suddenly, 15 gunmen jumped out of their SUVs. The hit team fired over 500 rounds into their target. One sicario fired a rocket launcher, but missed. After a few minutes, the deafening sound of automatic fire stopped. The sicarios got back into their SUVs and the convoy sped off. Edgar, his cousin Cesar, and the son of a high-level cartel money launderer were left dead in a pool of blood. They never had a chance. Frida came out running from the supermarket only to find her husband dead. Chapo had taken a great loss. Edgar was a rising capo, always present at cartel meetings. Now, the Chapo was planning his son's funeral. Edgar wasn't the last narco junior to fall during the war. Most bosses would end up losing a son. One of Arturo's main security chiefs, bringing the fight to El Chapo and El Mayo, was Fausto Isidro Meza Flores, better known as El Chapo Isidro. Isidro was involved in the trafficking business since the early 2000s. He began by moving shipments for the Juarez cartel, then ended up working for the Beltran Leyva organization. When the war kicked off, both El Chapo and Arturo called Isidro to gain his allegiance. Isidro remained loyal to the Beltran brothers. His group, based in Guasave, would become a real headache for El Chapo and El Mayo. His people were the real deal. They rarely took losses and were known as hardcore Beltran Leyva. It was thanks to them that most of El Chapo and El Mayo sicarios in northern Sinaloa were either killed or had to lay low. Chapo Isidro was involved in the famous battle, El Burillon, where a large convoy of trucks attempted to enter Guasave, El Chapo Isidro's hometown and power base. Isidro's men decimated El Chapo and El Mayo's men. From then on, Isidro would earn the nickname the Anthrax Nightmare. Another group that was flying the Beltran Leyva flag were Los Charritos, a group made up of mostly teenage pistoleros loyal to Arturo, led by 19-year-old Gonzalo Araujo. The tight-knit group of teenage gunners might have been young, but more than made up for it with their aggressive nature. Whenever members ran into El Chapo and El Mayo's people, it was on sight. For Chalito, as Gonzalo was known, it was also personal. El Mayo was involved in his father's death years back. Now, it was his turn to torment El Mayo and his people. Los Charritos were responsible for the death of Atanasio Torres, the oldest son of Manuel Torres Felix, El M1, a high-level trafficker and security chief, part of the Mayo Zumbada organization. On April 18, Los Charritos cornered Atanasio while he was driving with his 4-year-old sister, Alondra. After a brief standoff, the hit team shot and killed Atanasio and wounded his sister. It is said that upon hearing the news, El M1 lost it. It was a major loss for El M1. After his son's death, he became more sadistic in the way he dealt with the enemy, personally torturing more than 50 people associated with the death of his son. Manuel Torres would go on to be one of the most active leaders fighting the Beltran Leyvas, especially Chalito and his gunmen. On May 26, Los Charritos were involved in an infamous shootout in the Las Vegas neighborhood of Culiacan. When federal police raided a safe house belonging to Los Charritos, several members of the group were surrounded. They radioed for backup. Within 15 minutes, Chalito arrived with reinforcements and several armored SUVs. They began to spray automatic fire and threw numerous grenades at the officers. The rescue operation was successful and solidified Chalito and his gunmen into street legends. Los Charritos would go on to kill numerous allies of El Chapo and El Mayo. June 10th would be an especially bloody day. Los Charritos led a large group of gunmen, numbering around 70 members. They were on their way to Mega 2000, an auto repair shop owned by one of El Mayo's sicarios. The sicarios burst into the shop and without saying a word, opened up with everything they had. In total, 9 people were killed, most of them innocent civilians who had the misfortune of stopping by at the wrong time. The gunmen piled into their 10 SUVs and sped off. A short distance later, local cops began to chase the convoy. The gunmen stopped and began to engage the officers. It didn't take long for backup to arrive. A nearby patrol of soldiers heard the shootout and immediately raced towards the area. The convoy of sicarios escaped the area, but only after one of their trucks was completely disabled. The police gradually gained the upper hand. When the soldiers arrived, only one lone sicario, known as Horacio, emerged from the Cherokee, which by now had been turned into Swiss cheese. His comrades were all dead. Horacio dragged himself out of the SUV, barely able to speak, and his arm, almost completely torn off. He slumped down to the ground and asked for water and help. The soldiers stood over him, but it was clear he would receive no help from them. Horacio lasted around 40 minutes before finally dying. His custom AK, with a skull engraved into the stock, was found inside the Cherokee. On June 17th, local cop Ricardo Villa had just left his house. As his Nissan SUV stopped at a red light, a silver Jeep Liberty blocked Villa, and men wearing tactical vests began to spray his vehicle with automatic AKs and AR-15s, killing Villa instantly. A few blocks away, a local transit cop, Demetrio Verdugo, saw what had just occurred and gave chase. The cruiser caught up with the Jeep Liberty, and both vehicles came to a stop. Officer Verdugo tried to exit his squad car as fast as he could to engage, but he wasn't fast enough. A sicario jumped out of the Liberty and emptied the entire drum magazine into the squad car before Verdugo could even open the door. With no more enemies in sight, the sicario sped off again to fight another day. Ricardo Villa was targeted for being on the Chapo side. Verdugo just happened to be at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was only a few days shy of retirement. In October, an incident happened that would become an infamous example of the power Arturo had. It was a cool afternoon when Garcia Luna was traveling through Morelos, a state where Arturo had complete control. For several weeks, Arturo and Garcia Luna were supposed to meet face to face, but Garcia had postponed the meeting at least 3 times and had stopped taking his calls. So when Arturo learned from one of his informants that Garcia Luna was traveling through his territory, he sent El Grande to go get him by any means necessary. Garcia Luna was traveling in a 7-vehicle convoy on the highway connecting Cuernavaca and Tepoztlan. El Grande was waiting for Garcia Luna's convoy with 100 heavily armed men wearing uniforms with the initials FEDA, which stood for Fuerzas Especiales de Arturo. The convoy stopped when they saw the massive 35-truck force blocking the highway. El Grande was the only one standing outside, arms stretched out to indicate it wasn't an ambush. After a few moments, Garcia Luna stepped out. El Grande told him, "Arturo wants to talk. You have to come with me." When Garcia Luna tried to talk his way out, El Grande interrupted and said, "Good or bad, you're coming with me." What could Garcia do? He was outnumbered. He agreed. Only 3 SUVs made the trip to Arturo's estate. When Garcia Luna entered the house, Arturo was waiting. Angered by Garcia Luna's actions, he slapped up the Secretary of Public Security of Mexico and said, "You think I'm a pendejo? I'm gonna kill you. I should take off your head right now." But before Arturo could follow through on his threat, El Grande spoke up. "No, don't kill him please, Jefe, or else the entire government is gonna come down on us." Arturo just responded, "You see how easy it is to get to you?" As things settled down, the 3 sat outside in a patio area. Hector Beltran was also there. No one was allowed near the conversation, so Hector would occasionally get up to serve drinks. Arturo got down to business. Garcia Luna said the war was between them. It didn't involve him. He would continue working for both. Arturo became angry, declaring, "A deal is a deal." He reminded Garcia Luna that it was thanks to him that he was Secretary of Public Security in the first place. The group continued drinking and smoking. The meeting lasted around 4 hours. At the end, Garcia Luna agreed to back Arturo. Arturo told him, "Don't worry about the money. Whatever they're paying you, I'll match it." Arturo and Garcia Luna shook hands, and the Secretary of Public Security with his bodyguards were driven back to the larger group that was still waiting on the highway. Afterwards, Arturo, Hector, and El Grande could be heard laughing at the situation. They especially found it funny when one of the gunmen asked about a pile of 9mm magazines that were left sitting on the table. With a big laugh, Arturo informed his pistolero that they belonged to Garcia Luna's bodyguards, who were disarmed by Arturo's men. On October 16, one of the most controversial police operations took place in Mexico City. Federal Police Commissioner Victor Garay led the operation with the aim of capturing Harold Poveda, alias El Conejo, one of Arturo's main cocaine suppliers. In the early morning hours, Poveda was celebrating his girlfriend's birthday at his mansion he named La Mansión de Fantasía. The large estate had its own zoo with white tigers, panthers, gorillas, and lions. Among his guests were more than 30 high-class prostitutes, a jeweler selling expensive pieces to Poveda's fellow traffickers that were invited to the event. A little past midnight, one of the maids alerted Poveda to a large group of police that was gathering outside the main entrance. At the same time, the federales began to break down the front gate. One of Poveda's bodyguards yelled, "Run, Jefe, the federales are here," and with that, panic ensued. Poveda managed to escape through the back and into a nearby wooded area. Comandante Bayardo requested a helicopter to locate Poveda, but his boss, Victor Garay, shot down his request citing poor weather conditions. Ultimately, Poveda got away, but his guests weren't as lucky. His girlfriend Juliana, the jeweler, the prostitutes, and some of his associates were caught. Over the next 3 days, the federal agents went on an orgy of debauchery. Victor Guerrero took 3 of the prostitutes, ordered cocaine, and enjoyed himself in the jacuzzi room with his new friends. Meanwhile, Comandante Bayardo and Agent Navarro began to torture Poveda's associates. They gave him such a beating that some of the men could barely walk afterwards. The pair even went to another safe house belonging to the group in order to steal cash and jewelry. At one point, after the discovery of $500,000 in cash, the 2 federales got into a physical altercation over who got to keep the money. Victor Garay was blamed for letting Poveda escape, which was no accident. What El Mayo and the Chapo didn't know back in March was that Garay had met secretly with Arturo in Acapulco in exchange for a multi-million-dollar bribe, agreed to join Arturo's side. From then on, Garay protected Arturo and his people as best as he could. There were many times when his own Comandante Bayardo had located La Barbie, Poveda, or even Arturo himself. Garay always came up with a way to sabotage the operation. Poveda called Arturo soon after. Arturo told him it was the work of Jesus El Rey Zumbada, El Mayo's younger brother, but not to worry, he was going to take care of El Rey. Arturo repaid the favor by pulling off a major win. On October 20th, just 4 days after the raid on Poveda's mansion, AFI agents working for the Beltran Leyvas located El Rey Zumbada, a key player within El Mayo's organization. The Federales engaged in an hours-long shootout with El Rey's bodyguards. The group was hiding out in a Mexico City mansion when they were caught by surprise. Arturo's main security chief, El Grande Villarreal, and some of his men were embedded with the AFI agents while the shootout was happening. They wore AFI uniforms in order to blend in with the operation. The shootout was an incredible sight. On one side were federales and Mexico City cops trying to detain a narco boss, while at the same time, federales moonlighting as bodyguards for El Rey were firing at their fellow cops from the safe house. After the traffickers surrendered, El Grande ordered the AFI agents to take pictures of El Rey. He sent the pictures to a journalist on the payroll, who immediately published the photos. The reason for this? El Grande knew El Mayo also had his own AFI agents and commanders on his payroll. The pictures were meant to discourage AFI bosses from swapping El Rey for a lower level member and then releasing the kingpin, because according to El Grande, in Mexico, anything is possible. A brother for a brother. Arturo hit El Mayo where it hurt, and Mayo didn't take the news well. While this has never been proven, the rumor going around was that El Mayo retaliated by assassinating the Secretary of the Interior, Juan Camillo Maurino. According to informants, El Mayo's men planted C4 explosives on his Learjet. The aircraft exploded in midair when it reached Mexico City, killing Maurino and everyone on board. The war was reaching new levels of violence, never seen before. The capture of El Rey would eventually lead to the downfall of the dirty cops working for Genaro Garcia Luna. Along with El Rey, his son Jesus and his Colombian stepson Ricardo were also captured. El Rey's son proved to be the downfall of several federal cops. Once in the interrogation room, Jesus Jr. and Ricardo began to sing. They gave up the names of the various cops that worked for the Sinaloa cartel: Garcia Luna, Victor Garay, Edgar Bayardo, Francisco Navarro, Luis Palomino, and others. The PGR began building cases against the agents. The same agents who days earlier had been hailed as heroes in the fight against drug trafficking were now paraded in the same conference room as suspects in the biggest corruption scandal since the General Rebollo case of 1997. The gig was up. The agents were looking at long prison terms if convicted. But this being Mexico, Garcia Luna managed to pull some strings, and eventually most of the agents were quietly left off the hook. But there was the problem of Jesus Zumbada, El Rey's son, who was now a cooperating witness, and Edgar Bayardo, who also began cooperating with the Attorney General's office. There was a local military commander near Chipalcingo that was going after Beltran Leyva people. One of Arturo's most trusted lieutenants, known as El Rojo was in charge of the area. So in December, El Rojo and his men gave an answer to the general in charge. It was a December night in the city of Chipalcingo, and a large group of young men were making their way through town. They were on leave from the military base nearby. Suddenly, several SUVs intercepted the soldiers. 8 soldiers were kidnapped by armed gunmen. On December 21st, the bodies of the dead soldiers were found in various plastic bags. They were decapitated. A note was also found. For every one of us you kill, we'll kill 10 of you. Over the next year, there was a brutal war between El Rojo and the military. It got to a point where if you were one of El Rojo's men and you were cornered by the military, you better have a bullet for yourself. The soldiers in Guerrero never forgot the brutal killings of their comrades. So anytime they captured a gunman working for El Rojo or anyone working for the Beltran Leyvas, they could expect brutal torture until he was finally shot in the head and dumped on the side of the road or thrown into the sea. In the meantime, the war continued. El Chapo and Mayo were moving constantly between Sinaloa, Durango, Baja California, and Nayarit, also staying one step ahead of hit teams, army units, and federal police working for the Beltran Leyva brothers. Arturo was also hitting shipments belonging to El Mayo and El Chapo. In one notorious incident, El Chapo had just bought 2 tons of ephedrine. Merchandise was stored on a ranch in Belize, just waiting for the perfect opportunity to be smuggled over the border into Mexico. After several days, the shipment was successfully smuggled. El Mayo provided a tanker truck for the merchandise and some of his men to move it north. El Chapo and Mayo were cautious. Arturo and the Zeta allies were constantly taking down shipments belonging to them, but they still went ahead with the operation. On the ground, Luis Alberto Cabrera, aka El Arqui, and a small group of sicarios were in charge of escorting the tanker on the trip north to Culiacan. A few days into the trip, El Arqui called in Mayo's people to let them know the tanker was stopped by PFP agents at a roadblock in Tabasco, but that he was negotiating with them to release it. The PFP commander in charge was working for Los Zetas, but he was willing to negotiate. He was demanding 150 grand to let the tanker pass and not alert his Zeta and Beltran associates. El Mayo gave El Arqui the go-ahead to pay the bribe. The tanker was cleared and the convoy continued north into Veracruz. However, a few hours later, El Arqui called again. As soon as the convoy reached the first highway police station in Veracruz, a large convoy of Zeta gunmen ambushed them and took the tanker. Only El Arqui and one of his men managed to escape. Turns out the PFP commander they bribed took the money and then alerted his Zeta and Beltran Leyva associates. The loss amounted to 2 tons of ephedrine and 500 keys of coke. This would not be the last time a big shipment was lost to the Beltran Leyva and their Zeta allies. The Beltran Leyvas had whole units of gunmen just constantly on the lookout for big shipments to rip off. The Beltranes were in a state of always attacking. For Arturo, it was total war. Mayo and El Chapo were forced to move their southern smuggling operations farther north along the coast. Meanwhile, the war continued into 2009. In Culiacan, Los Anthrax, El M1, El Macho Prieto, Cholo Ivan, El Bravo, El Fantasma, and others were fighting Los Charritos, Los Mazatlecos, Zetas, and Carrillo Fuentes gunmen all over the state. Gunmen were kidnapped, brutally tortured for information, and then finally, if they were lucky, they were taken out with a round to the head. Otherwise, they were doomed to a slow, sadistic type of death. The Beltranes also took losses. El Chapo and El Mayo had crews all over Sonora, doing their best to disrupt one of the Beltran Leyva's most important routes. Both sides were fighting for key border crossings like Nogales and Agua Prieta. On January 29, 2009, Arturo took a major hit when his cousin, Jeronimo Gomez, was captured while meeting with a member of the Norte del Valle cartel, Pablo Emilio Robles. The two were having dinner in an upscale restaurant in Mexico City. Not only was Gomez Arturo's cousin, he was an important member of the cartel. He was the one who would actually fly down to Colombia and Panama to meet with coke suppliers, negotiate prices, making sure the flow of merchandise never stopped. I mean, this one guy had access to a large amount of Beltran Leyva money bank accounts holding hundreds of millions of dollars each that were used by Gomez to buy future shipments, buy ships, pay crews all over South America. This was family and a huge deal within their organization. On April 18, 2009, Gomez landed in Tepic Airport. Together with his other co-defendants, they boarded an armored van, escorted by 2 federal police units. The entire convoy was supposed to make its way to the federal prison at Rincon, a short drive from the airport. As the convoy began to move out, a local camera crew also began to follow from a distance to document the transfer of a high-level narco. It was supposed to be a routine assignment for the news crew. As they drove down the highway, they couldn't have imagined that just up ahead, lying in wait, were 3 armored SUVs loaded with Beltran Leyva gunmen, heavily armed with full auto AKs and M16s. Suddenly, as the news crew was recording footage of the convoy as they traveled on the highway, automatic fire began hitting the front vehicles. A huge cloud of dust went up as the vehicles skidded onto the side of the road. It was a short but intense gun battle with the front unit of federal police. The sicarios tore up the front vehicle and everyone inside, but in the confusion, the van carrying Games was able to speed past the ambush. As for the sicarios that attempted to free Games, they were tracked down and arrested. It turned out that most of the gunmen that day were active duty federal cops. At the time, Arturo was spending time between several places: Cuernavaca, Monterrey, Mexico City, and Puebla. His security kept him safe and one step ahead of the government and his enemies. He was under a lot of pressure. Safe houses were still being raided. His people were still being targeted by the government. Arturo started using coke more frequently and became more paranoid. As his circle became smaller, he began to suspect his closest associates of betrayal. Sometimes it was just the drugs talking, but sometimes he was right. In mid-2009, Arturo sobered up and realized that Pineda Villa brothers were lying to him. After hearing some rumors, he ordered an internal investigation of product and crews. Arturo found out the brothers were also transporting coke that belonged to El Chapo. That betrayal by close associates was unforgivable. Arturo protected the brothers in the past and even brought them into the organization. This wasn't the only crew acting out of order. By 2009, there were problems with different crews in the southern areas. Word got back to Arturo that in the interior of Guerrero, certain crews had begun extorting and harassing civilians, and sometimes they moved shipments belonging to the enemy. By the end of August, Arturo decided to clean house. Beltran Leyva death squads made a sweep through Morelos and Guerrero. He gave the order to El Grande and El Rojo to lead the operation. They were in charge of hunting down traitors and killing them. One of the first to go was Alberto Pineda, El Borrado. El Grande kidnapped him and beat him to death. El Grande was quoted as saying, "I personally kidnapped that pig. He thought he was so bloodthirsty. Besides, I didn't like him anyway. I tied him up and stomped him until he lost consciousness." The next day, El MP, his brother, was found by the side of the road. One of the biggest generators of violence, according to the government, was Arturo and his brothers. These gunmen were especially violent and were known to shoot it out with police and soldiers. But taking down Arturo would not be easy. He moved around with well-trained security, usually made up of former soldiers or cops. His early warning networks in Morelos and Guerrero were effective. It was going to be a bloodbath if it wasn't planned right. Since the army had a bunch of leaks and corruption problems, the job of hunting down the boss of bosses was given to a unit of Special Forces Marines. On March 24, 2009, Arturo took another hit when his Monterrey Plaza boss, Hector La Burra Huerta, was captured. For months, the government had been trying to bring down the Beltran Leyvas in Monterrey. It was the capture of a high-level Zeta ally of the Beltran Leyvas in Monterrey that would lead to his location. On that day, Hector Ruiz Huerta arrived at the luxury car dealership he owned. His business, Eurodrive, was located in the wealthy San Pedro de Garza. He arrived in an armored silver Suburban. He, along with 4 bodyguards, were surprised when civilians inside the dealership suddenly pointed guns at them and placed them under arrest. Special Forces soldiers had infiltrated the business as customers, lying in wait for Huerta to arrive. He was arrested without a fight. Within days, Arturo already had his replacement in charge of the important plaza. A trafficker from Sonora, Rodolfo Lopez Ibarra, known as El Nito, was now running things for Arturo in Monterrey. On May 14th, he held a meeting at a restaurant in Monterrey with the heads of different crews operating under the Beltran Leyva organization. Recently, there was tension about who should take over after Huerta's arrest. El Nito was there to set things straight. He was still flying the Beltran Leyva flag, and anyone not okay with that meant going to war with Arturo Beltran. Most aligned with the new administration, but for El Nito, his reign would be even shorter. Just 4 days after that meeting, Nito and several bodyguards were flying back to Monterrey from Acapulco. As soon as their private jet landed, the group was detained by soldiers. The soldiers and federal police were waiting for Nito at the airport, where they had already captured his gunmen, waiting on the ground with 2 SUVs. Slowly, control of Monterrey began to slip away from Arturo. During all of this chaos, Héctor El Negro Saldana was a high-level Beltran Leyva operator in San Pedro de Garza, located within the Monterrey metro area. He smelled an opportunity to rise to power. He stopped following orders and instead broke away to form his own trafficking group and take control of the plaza for himself. To fund his war against Arturo Beltran, Saldana began to kidnap wealthy residents. He was also extorting bars, restaurants, clubs. Saldana's crew was collecting on average $7,500 from each one. Unfortunately for Saldana, this made him 2 enemies. Arturo for one, but also the mayor of San Pedro, Mauricio Fernandez, who was under pressure by business owners to do something about the kidnappings and extortion. The mayor was also being threatened by Saldana himself. It is believed Arturo and the mayor joined forces to take out Saldana. The war was short. 5 months after he broke away, in October 2009, Arturo's gunmen finally caught up to Saldana. He was kidnapped and later found dead on a street corner. A message was written on a piece of cardboard left beside the body. For being kidnappers, the boss, bosses. Job 38:15. That last bit of text refers to the Bible quote, "From the wicked their light is withheld, and their uplifted arm is broken." Comandante Magaña was a feared Beltran Leyva security chief. He was in charge of hunting down rivals. Magaña operated under the orders of El Buche. El Buche was a close and trusted member of Arturo's inner circle. The Comandante Magaña, whose real name was Gerardo Magaña, was a Sinaloan gunman that had a long history of working for Arturo Beltran. He was hardcore Beltran Leyva and was at the time fighting 2 enemies at once. One of them was El Güero Huetamo, who used to be Beltran Leyva, but then switched over to El Chapo's side when the war began. Since then, he led a group of gunmen fighting to take control of Acapulco for El Chapo. Comandante Magaña was also fighting the local police unit that was also working for El Chapo. On the night of June 6, 2009, Comandante Magaña and his bodyguards were heading back home to a nearby seaside mansion. Another night of women drinking and spending a small fortune on a good time in the city they controlled. The armored SUV drove at top speed. Everyone was in a humorous mood, while the speakers kept in the background a steady playlist of corridos, tracks that described the same lifestyle they were living. The crew was traveling along the Miguel Alemán coastal highway. The route gives travelers an amazing view of the ocean along the sandy beaches. Suddenly, one of Magaña's people spots a crew of Güero Huetamo's gunmen near an SUV, standing by the boardwalk, talking to several women. Comandante Magaña orders the SUV to turn around, and he and his gunmen began to fire on the rival group. That began a short gun battle between the 2 sides. Then suddenly as it began, the group sped away when federal police began to arrive. A nearby military base sent out military units when the feds requested help. The commander of the army units recalls that as soon as his units left the front gate of the base, they were constantly being tracked by Beltran Leyva hawks, following them in sedans and motorbikes. Then at one point, a Humvee spots a speeding SUV with armed men inside, barrels sticking out the windows and all. After a short chase with the Humvee, Comandante Magaña arrived at the safe house, where a gun battle began. Soldiers and federal police surrounded the area and began to shoot it out with the sicarios. Comandante Magaña called La Barbie for backup. A short time later, one of La Barbie's main security chiefs arrives. El Chucky was the man in charge of the rescue attempt. The group arrived in an armored Chevy Suburban and began to open fire on the soldiers and federal police. They opened up with full auto AKs with drum magazines and were throwing grenades as fast as they could. At one point, the gunmen got close to breaking through, but the soldiers and federales repelled the attack. The soldiers' belt-fed machine guns and automatic grenade launchers atop their Humvees made all the difference. Comandante Chucky lay dead in the SUV along with some of his gunmen. The rest threw their weapons and gave up. It was now clear a rescue would not be successful. At that point, Comandante Magaña decided to take the only escape option he had. The Sicario chief boarded a black Mercedes SUV and with his surviving gunmen at full speed crashed through the garage doors and attempted to flee the area. The narcos fired out the windows in full auto at the soldiers and police, but the tires were quickly shut out and the SUV ended up crashing into a wall. A Humvee then rammed the SUV to prevent it escaping. The soldiers aboard jumped out and began to empty their magazines into the vehicle at almost point-blank range. When the commanding officer ordered his soldiers to stop shooting, Comandante Magaña lay dead with his men. The military lost 2 soldiers. At the same time, some gunmen were able to escape by jumping out the back onto a nearby roof of a business, where they jumped down onto the street and disappeared into the crowd. A powerful cell of loyal Beltran Leyva gunmen was wiped out in one night. Comandante Magaña knew better than anyone the military had a real hate for Beltran Leyva members. Ever since El Rojo decapitated 8 soldiers in Chipalcingo, captured gunmen belonging to the Beltran Leyvas could expect brutal torture at the hands of the soldiers before they were killed. It is said Arturo and the top bosses threw a party in their honor for Comandante Magaña and his men, a final farewell by their fellow gunmen, bosses, and associates. Comandante Magaña was a tough loss for the organization, but it kept on with business, felt barely an effect on supply or profits. That's just how the business runs itself. Every day there's money to be made in the US, just depends on who's quick enough to take advantage. Arturo was always a trafficker through and through, a country boy at heart, always viewed the world in the old school way. A handshake and your word meant it was as good as gold. And as a true Sinaloense, parties were a regular event in his life. The Beltranes were a large family. There was always some type of event taking place. Most were not involved in the drug business though. The majority of Beltranes worked legitimately and lived regular lives. Whether it was baptisms, weddings, quinceañeras, or getting together with his crew, Arturo was always on the move, always a presence in his own family, even when at war. Arturo loved his kids, his wife, and family. He was known to be very generous of friends and workers. He was the godfather for so many events, paid for people's surgeries, even sent out planes to remote towns to fly people out for medical attention, bought mansions in most states of the country, owned private planes, expensive horses. He also had a fleet of helicopters. Many times he escaped a raid or two by flying out of the area in one of his helicopters. The money kept rolling in. Even at this point in the war, with massive losses for both sides, the DEA estimates Arturo was bringing in 400 to 500 million a month, but everything was about to come crumbling down. On August 20th, 2009, the US government unsealed a criminal indictment against the Beltran Leyva organization, specifically Arturo. Then in December 2009, the Mexican government closed ranks and decided Arturo Beltran was their #1 target. This group was causing chaos with their brutality and bloody MO. Even with all his bribes, he had become too much of a liability to the government. The hunt was to be led by specially trained Marines who were now ready to hit the streets in search of the boss of bosses. At the same time, someone close to Arturo was now actively planning to sell him out to the DEA. Arturo was now under the crosshairs of everyone. Arturo's final days can be traced back to December 5th, 2009. On that day, Arturo was in Atlixco, Puebla. He was attending the baptism of one of his godsons. The young parents of the boy were related to Arturo, and he was staying at their home for a few days. Little did Arturo know he was being tracked. The DEA was getting closer to capturing him, thanks to their high-level informant. 2 days later, on December 7th, Arturo heads to Cholula to attend a meeting with some of his capos. Then he traveled to his mansion in Puebla City, where 2 nurses arrived to attend to Arturo. The fact that both ladies were young, curvy, and had pretty faces, I'm sure had nothing to do in the hiring process. Either way, both girls were there to check his vitals every so often and provide comfort to the boss in more ways than one. After a few hours, one nurse left. The other nurse, Osmeida, stayed with Arturo for the night. On the morning of December 9th, they both had breakfast together. Osmeida recounted that Arturo barely talked to her as he was constantly making calls or taking calls on his cell. Many of those calls were to his wife, but what exactly was said is unknown. Osmeida finished breakfast and went upstairs as Arturo continued on his phone. At around 5:30 in the evening, he told her to change. They were heading out. Osmeida, Arturo, his pilot, and a bodyguard all rode in the same Suburban en route to his helicopter, which was stationed at a nearby hotel. At one point, the convoy of SUVs stopped, and Arturo and his pilot stepped out to talk. They realized the airfield they planned to land at did not allow helicopters to land or take off after 7 p.m. They wouldn't make it in time, so they headed back. They would fly out the following morning. Arturo then asked for a phone and made 2 calls, one to his family and another to a woman named Anna, who assured him she was sending 24 of the best looking girls for the party he was hosting the following night. Around noon the next day, the group drove to the hotel Fiesta Americana, where Arturo had his helicopter waiting to transport him to Cuernavaca. Arturo, Osmeida, and a bodyguard would all fly together, and after 5 minutes on the tarmac, the helicopter took off. The trip lasted about 25 minutes before they arrived in the city, Cuernavaca. They landed in an empty field on the outskirts. A waiting convoy of trucks then took everyone to Arturo's residence, located in the upscale area of the city. It was a large property with two main structures on a large plot of land. Arturo arrived and began to inquire about the festivities and making sure his staff were on top of things. He stopped at one point to play a round of pool. At around the same time, Arturo heard the news that the same gunman that had transported the group to the helicopter just hours earlier was involved in a shootout with Puebla state cops. This was a party for himself and his people, his gunmen and capos that helped him run the whole operation. He wanted to treat the crew to a pre-Christmas party. They made it this far in their war against the Chapo and his allies. Arturo and his people had taken losses, but they still held power in key plazas. They still controlled crucial border crossings, and most of all, they were alive and free. It was time to celebrate and enjoy the benefits of being traficantes pesados. His capos called him a variety of names. La Barbie called him Tío, El Grande, Papá. The rest of the party addressed him as either Señor or simply Jefe. Arturo informed El Grande that he hired several musical acts, Los Cadetes de Linares, Ramón Ayala, and Torrente. After greeting his capos, Arturo and Osmeida retired to his bedroom for a quick nap. According to El Grande, Arturo emerged from the bedroom to eat something and then went back to sleep. Around 7 p.m. he awoke and began to change for the party. Arturo wore a tan suit with a light-colored shirt. A large gold cross hung from his neck. He was also wearing an Orisha bracelet. He was wearing gold and diamond rings. And to top it all off, tucked into his belt, a chrome 38 Super with custom engraved gold grips. Later in the afternoon, El Grande arrived with his gunman. Don Arturo sat in a large chair. It resembled a throne. He sat behind a large coffee table. To one side, he had his gold-plated AK-47. On the other side sat his nurse. The Barbie was wearing a navy blue suit. El Grande was sporting jeans, a gray shirt, dad hat, with an AK-47 slung over his shoulder. At one point, Osmeida overheard Arturo tell La Barbie, El Chapo and El Mayo are sending people to Puebla. He's already buying up cops and military commanders. La Barbie responded, let him come to Cuernavaca. I'll personally go after them. Around 8 p.m., the musicians arrived. The three bands sat in a large hallway, waiting their turn to play for Arturo and his guests. When it was time to begin the show, El Grande told Guadalupe Tijerina, the lead singer of the legendary Los Cadetes de Linares, Cántenle corridos del norte pa mi tío. And with that, the party was now underway. Then it was Ramón Ayala's turn. The iconic norteño artist began to perform his classics. That night, Arturo requested two of his favorite corridos, Puño de Tierra and Gerardo González. This last one was a personal favorite of the boss of bosses. The corrido is dedicated to an old-school pistolero from Tamaulipas. At around 9 p.m., the girls from Acapulco arrived. Arturo greeted each woman with a kiss to the cheek while his hands were all over them. Meanwhile, his personal chef, Atanasio Reyes, was busy in the garden area, preparing the beef tacos and other dishes for the guests. One of the chef's helpers, Tony, recalled that they were eating grilled beef tacos and beer. There was also a ton of whiskey and tequila. Some of the guests were doing lines of coke, while Arturo and others were busy dancing with the girls. El Grande started to hand Arturo huge stacks of $100 bills, which Arturo began throwing in the air for the girls. He told them to get comfortable and lose their clothes. The women were now dancing either completely naked or with just underwear. One of the women described the following scene. He began to make it rain $100 bills, while more than 20 naked women began to scramble for the cash. They were so excited. It was like little kids going after the fallen goodies from a piñata. All of this while Ramón Ayala continued playing. Then, while Arturo was dancing and throwing more money in the air, and pulled one of the members of the group Torrente to dance with the women. The band member ended up having his shirt pulled off by the girls, while Arturo kept on throwing more cash into the mix. Arturo was already tipsy when he threw the last stack of bills. When the group of women dove towards the cash near Arturo, it sent the boss tumbling down onto his throne. And meanwhile, the government had him in their crosshairs. But he's out partying without a care in the world. How? You'd think a heavyweight like Arturo would be hiding in a bunker somewhere. But the thing most of these bosses understand better than anyone is how fleeting life is. In their line of business, getting to the top is risky. Every day in that life could be your last. So they party like it's their last day on earth. That's why bosses have events that sometimes last 3 days straight. Knowing they can be taken out at any time fuels a need to enjoy life at every chance, even while trying to stay one step ahead of the law. At around 2 in the morning, El Grande received an urgent radio call. One of his gunmen informed him that there were pickup trucks roaming near the house. El Grande stepped away from the party to take a look for himself. When El Grande and his gunmen saw the people dressed in black, they began firing at El Grande and his men. A shootout began. The party crashers were actually Marines Special Forces, El Grande ran to find Arturo. Fuga, jefe, fuga! The only thing Arturo was able to take with him was his gold-plated AK. By this point, Arturo was drunk and barely able to run, so El Grande and La Barbie picked up Arturo and brought him to a waiting SUV. The boss fled the scene before the Marines could seal the area. By the end of the night, the Marines had more than 40 people detained. The girls, the bands, the guests, which included an army major and a captain. The Marines beat some of the guests and stole the band members' jewelry. They also found several $100,000 in cash. During the shootout, local and federal police arrived, but when they realized who the Marines were dealing with, they left the scene. The Marines were on their own. For days, no one knew where he was, except, of course, his closest capos. Then a few days later, the DEA received info from a high-level informant. Arturo was staying at a condo complex in Cuernavaca named Altitude. On December 16, 2009, Arturo was busy making sure everything was ready for a special guest he was going to have dinner with later that night, an Army Commander, Leopoldo Diaz Perez. By 3 p.m., the food was being prepared by a chef. His most trusted capos were there also. They were going to discuss cooperating with the commander against their enemies. La Barbie, El Rojo, El Buche, and 2 other sicarios were there. But little did they know that by nightfall, most would end up dead. Arturo was staying in apartment 201 on the 2nd floor of the tower. At around 1 p.m., Arturo began to receive reports from his network of lookouts on the street. They were reporting a large number of military patrols near the towers. Although aware of the situation, Arturo trusted his security to get him out if they were after him. Initially, he thought they were routine patrols. At 3:30 p.m., the Marines began Operation Cuerno 3. They successfully identified several bodyguards near the entrances to the tower. They were neutralized. At the same time, inside the condo, Arturo's chef was busy preparing the evening meal. Then Arturo realized Barbie was gone. No one had noticed when exactly La Barbie made his exit. Arturo called him, but Barbie wasn't answering his phone. By 5 p.m., a helicopter began to circle above the towers. It was then that Arturo realized he was the target. Arturo and his capos began to prepare. They loaded AK and AR-15 magazines, prepared grenades, which they had plenty of. At 7 p.m., an Mi-17 helicopter began to hover above the tower as a squad of Marines rappelled down ropes onto the roof. At 8 p.m., the shootout began when a team of Marines began to make its way up the stairs to the 2nd floor where Arturo was located. His sicarios opened up on the Marines with assault rifles and grenades. One Marine took a direct hit from a grenade and would end up losing his life from the injuries. He was quickly dragged away by his comrades as other Marines returned fire and traded insults with the sicarios firing back. The fallen Marine was quickly rushed to a medical facility, but unfortunately he died on the way there. Arturo's sicarios were seasoned veterans of shootouts. They kept the Marines at bay for more than an hour. Then a short time after the firefight began, the Marines on the roof made their way towards a stairwell. Arturo was now facing 2 separate forces coming from both directions. The Marines were also receiving fire from the windows of the condo. Midway through the fight, Arturo called La Barbie. He told him to send reinforcements. La Barbie said that it was better for Arturo to surrender. There was no hope of rescue. La Barbie would not be sending any help. It was at this point the boss of bosses realized not only was he being abandoned by his capo, it was now clear Barbie was the informer all along. One last betrayal, which cemented his decision to go down fighting. Arturo then called one of his other sicario chiefs, who immediately sent 2 of his best gunmen. The gunmen loaded up with guns, grenades, ammo, and body armor. They sped towards the towers. At the Altitude apartments, they could see the impenetrable ring of soldiers, both from the 24th Infantry in the outer ring and the Marines surrounding the building. They changed their plan, seeing the number of soldiers on the ground and the formidable arsenal of weapons they had brought with them. Deciding instead on taking some of the heat away from Arturo and created a diversion which could have let the boss escape from the complex. They made their way to a Red Cross building across the street and began to fire at the soldiers and throwing grenades. After a short time though, the sicarios were killed. At 9 p.m., the Marines received the order to storm the condo. Little by little, they made their way up the stairs. As the Marines finally reached the 2nd floor, they shot and killed El Buche and El Rojo. Arturo's most important capos were now dead. Towards the end, one last sicario arrived to rescue Arturo, or at least attempt to rescue the boss. Arturo called Chalito Araujo when the shooting began. Chalito and Arturo were really close. Ever since the death of his father, Chalito had developed a close bond with Arturo. Arturo made it known that he thought of Chalito as a son, so when Arturo called his 20-year-old sicario chief for help, he didn't hesitate to come to the rescue of his tío. Chelito arrived solo, as he wasn't supposed to work that week. His gunmen were not with him that day, but nonetheless, he pushed forward. As soon as he arrived, he began to fire on the soldiers and Marines. But for all his fearlessness, in the end, the Marines were too much. He was outnumbered and was quickly taken down by at least 3 rounds to the body. Chelito, aka the terror of Culiacan, was no more. As the corrido says, his enemies could finally rest. By 9:30 p.m., all of his gunmen were dead. He was the last man standing. With 2 squads of Marines inching closer from above and below, the noose was tightening. Arturo decided long ago he wasn't going to be taken alive. He'd rather go down fighting. Better a grave in Mexico than a cell in the US. He began to throw grenades as fast as he could to push back the Marines and create an escape route. He ran towards the elevator, but was quickly shot by nearby Marines. Arturo Beltran Leyva died instantly. This is the official government version, but some of Arturo's people claim that he was wounded, but still alive, and was ultimately executed on the spot by the Marines who were on a mission to kill, not capture. It's also rumored that El Chapo somehow bribed the commander with clear instructions. Arturo could not survive the encounter. Whichever version is the truth, in the end, the boss of bosses was dead. When a team of government agents entered the condo to collect info, they stumbled across his corpse. The Marines had dragged Arturo's body inside the condo, where they pulled his pants down. A member of the forensics team took photos of the body sprawled out on the floor. These pictures would later land on the front pages of newspapers all over the country. This act would later have dire consequences. The boss of bosses was a bloody mess. A big chunk of his right shoulder was blown away. He had multiple gunshots all over his torso and head. Inside the condo were several assault rifles, ammo, and a few grenades left. There was a religious altar, family photographs strewn all over the bed, a brand new unopened Xbox. Almost every room was full of holes from assault rifles and grenades. The fallen Marine was 3rd Petty Officer Melquiset Angulo Cordova. Officer Cordova was honored as a Mexican hero during his funeral on December 21st, 2009, in his home state of Tabasco. He received the highest military honors offered by the country and was ushered to his grave by an honor guard made up of his close comrades wearing camouflage fatigues. His mother, Irma Cordova Padma, was presented a folded flag by the Secretary of the Navy. Hector Beltran was now in charge. One of the first things he did was send his Zeta allies to track down and kill the fallen Marine's family. He was angered by the way his brother's corpse was humiliated by the Marines. After the Marine's family returned home after the funeral, a Zeta hit squad broke into their home and executed his mother, brother, sister, and aunt. The final casualties related to the Battle of Cuernavaca. Arturo's body was claimed 2 days later by female family members. Arturo's sister Felicitas, his cousin Erica, and a close family friend traveled to Cuernavaca to collect the body. El Botas Blancas, El Tío, El Barbas, and finally, El Jefe de Jefes, as he was known to his people and enemies, was given a funeral in Culiacan. His family bought up all the white roses and flowers they could. His funeral was attended by mostly female family members or young kids, as most of the Beltran males were wanted by law enforcement or simply didn't want the numerous journalists and photographers to take their pictures. His gunmen and associates sent massive wreaths to their former boss. Arturo was to be laid to rest in his own mausoleum, built in the famous Jardines de Humaya cemetery. 2 weeks later, on December 30th, Arturo's brother Carlos was captured by federal police while driving around Culiacan with several guns, thousands of dollars, and a small bag of coke. Battles would continue to take place in Sonora, Sinaloa, Nayarit, and other states. The Beltran Leyva empire began a slow decline after Arturo's death. His brother Hector continued the war against El Chapo and El Mayo and launched a new war against La Barbie, who broke away and formed his own cartel. But the traitorous Barbie wouldn't last long either. Less than a year later, in August 2010, La Barbie was also captured by federal police, hiding out near Mexico City. In September 2010, Arturo's most trusted capo, El Grande, was captured in Puebla at his mansion while having lunch with his family. Both capos would later cooperate with prosecutors against their former comrades. Hector was captured in 2014 and died in prison from a heart attack in 2018. But even now, the Beltran family still has power and gunmen loyal to the family. People like El Chapo Isidro, El Músico, together with Beltran family members like Humberto, Mario Alberto, continue flying the Beltran flag. Arturo was respected and had a strong following among his people. Throughout the years, he had developed a reputation for being a solid businessman within the industry. Arturo and his brothers remained well respected. Could be due to their way of doing business. Could be because they were generous and liked to spread their wealth around. Or it could also be that when push came to shove, Arturo went down fighting, and his younger brother Alfredo took a life sentence rather than cooperate. Today, Arturo has gained a certain degree of notoriety. Countless corridos have been written in honor of Arturo and his brothers. For some corrido fans, Make no mistake, Arturo was an outlaw, a trafficker, and engaged in brutal, violent acts in pursuit of power and money. He ruled with an iron fist and exerted power far beyond what anyone thought possible back in La Palma.